So I'm going to talk a little bit about plant growth and development, and I'm going to also talk about some of the resources we have to find information on variety selection. So first of all, we do have a production guide available, and that the easiest way to obtain that guide is to Google NDSU Dry Bean Production Guide. And it is available on the web for download. There are also some hard copies available. The Bean Growers Association had some available. And then if you are looking in the booklet, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the crop development, because those are important things to know and the days to crop development. So for instance, on table 5 within the booklet, we have a table which talks about the description of some of the growth stages. So we'll go through that a little bit more in detail. But a couple of things interesting about the plant. I think most of you are familiar with the plant, but I want to point out a few of the critical things in the plant growth and development. So when we are looking at the plant developing, it first starts to swell, the seeds start to swell. And on the little picture here on the left part, you can see that there is a kind of a crook there. That is the crook where we have to be very careful if we do anything in the field, because if you, like for instance, some may do land rolling. If you do the land rolling at that particular point, you will break that one. And why is that so important? Because if you are looking at the little plant, then you can see that within the leaf axils, there are buds that can grow if the dominant bud is damaged for some reason. So I'm thinking about hail or other things. We want to know, where does the plant start to regrow from? So that damage on the center means that all the growing points will be gone from the plant, and therefore that is the most critical phase where you have to be very careful about the plant. So if we are looking at kind of more of a developing plant, we know that we have the cotyledon leaves, and then we do have the growing points within the cotyledon, where the cotyledon and the stem meet, as well as where each leaf, the unifoliate leaf, and then continuing in the trifoliate. So with damage due to hail or any damage by feeding, if we have some of the nodes, the axillary nodes available, those will then start the regrowth process. We talked a little bit about also the nodules. Of course, the nodules are typically on the root system, and I have just a picture here to show you some of the nodules in the field. So it is important to think about plant growth and development, because we want to kind of understand which stages the plants are at, and as we are also thinking about applying of herbicides, mostly those are related to the different growth stages. So if we are just kind of going through the growth stages in order, of course we have already talked about the crook stage. That stage is probably obtained about 7 to 8 days after planting. So DAP stands for days after planting. Then when the first leaves comes out, those are called the unifoliate leaves. And those are kind of direct opposite each other, like the cotyledons, but there is kind of a 90-degree difference between the cotyledons. So you always have 2 scars for the cotyledons and 2 scars for the unifoliate. And then the next stage is when we get to true leaf. We call that the trifoliate leaf. So the V1 is when we start counting the trifoliate leaves. So from there, we can go to the development in consecutive order. And the second leaf might be there in about 18 to 19 days. And then the plants start to continue. But in the second picture, as you can maybe see here, is that it is not only leaves coming out, but now we also see the branching starting to take place. And then all of a sudden, the plant starts to transition into the reproductive phase, which is probably at that 45, 46 days after planting. And we see that first flower bud visible, and then we transition into the actually bloom stage. So the R1 is considered the bloom stage, which is day 50 roughly. And again, when I give those days, it is kind of a rough indication. It depends on the variety. It depends on the growing season, but it gives you an idea of how long the season is going for. So then we are starting the development of the pod. So R2, we see already that half-inch pod on the first flower position. So we see now from flowering, we start at the beginning of the pod development. And then as the pods are about 1 inch long, that is about 55 days after planting, then the pod keeps on growing. And once the pod is full grown, that is what we call R4 or full pod. So there is always a sequence in the development of the plant. And then from the filling of the seeds starts at that R5, when actually the seeds are going to be visible in that pod. From there, we continue to the swelling of the seed, the development, all the photosynthetates are now translocated to the seed, and we see the development of R6 stage, 50% of the seed size. That's about day 65. And then we see that the seeds are completely filled in the pod, which is about 70 days. So at that point in pinto beans, we also see the striping of the bean itself. And then as the plant starts to mature, the first pods that were developed are also the ones that, of course, are the most mature. And the other beans are still a little bit green, but all the pods start to become yellow. Now then, kind of going to the full maturity, the halfway point is about 100 days, and the full maturity is that 105 days. Now that depends a little bit what year. Some years it is that 105, sometimes it's a few days earlier. But that's roughly when the plant is mature, but not yet ready for harvest. So we have to wait a few more days to get to that seed moisture dropping down, and then we can harvest. So in general, dry beans are indicated in a couple of types. So type 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 is that viney type that you sometimes have in your garden. But really what we are looking for mostly in our region is a type bush bean that can grow, and it can still continue growing if the conditions are right. So a bush bean. So typically we're moving more towards bush bean so that we can also do direct harvesting. So in the past year, we have here the years from 2018 to 22, and we see the acres planted in North Dakota. So you see the little bit lower planted acres compared to the previous 21, but kind of a lower number. But the planted acres from this past year, of course, dominant is the pinto with 73%. Black is about 13%, navy 10, and others about 4. And I'm talking here, this was planted acres in North Dakota. So the next couple of slides are going to be kind of similar. On the bottom, you will find the year. And then on the left-hand side, in the Y, you will see the pounds per acre. Now, this is data generated by the Statistical Service. And each dot is representing a year. And then we put a trend line through all the data. And then based on the formula, we come to the conclusion that for black beans over the period, so slightly from the 90s till now, we see about a 10% or sorry, a 10-pound increase on each year. Now, I want to point out that last year we had a number that was way below trend line. I put in another dot for this year. That here is based on the estimate of the Statistical Service without regard of the class. So it might be a little bit different for each class. So this is 10 pounds yield increase per year. For the navy bean, a similar situation. And you can see here that the navy has increased about 20 pounds per acre over that year. So the trend line doesn't mean that that is what we guarantee for next year, but it gives you an indication of what we might expect. And this is the stage yield. So if you're looking at the past, the trend line, we are somewhere 1,750 pounds trend line. No guarantees, but what we see in the slides is that the dots are all different. So based on the survey that we have been asking growers to give us some indication, we asked growers what percent of your acres were damaged by excess moisture. So the percent of excess moisture is again on the Y, and we have here the year. So I'm putting a couple of slides there. Last year, 2021, very dry, 2018 dry, but we had 2019 was pretty wet. So let's look at the data for the pintos and look at those points. So first of all, the trend line for the pinto beans for North Dakota show that there is probably a 20 pound of increase on an annual basis. But I want to point out that previous year, the drought year, we saw a very low number, far below the trend line. But if we look at a previous dry year, then you can see that typically if there is a dry year, but there is enough soil moisture, the yield tend to be a little bit above the trend line. However, when it is wet, we see that there is a little bit of a reduction of yield. Therefore, water management is one of the factors that is very important in the productivity of all our beans. They are very sensitive to excess moisture. So now I'm going to look a little bit at where we can find variety trial information. This is a picture from Variety Trials at Carrington. And in Carrington is dryland, which you can see here, and an irrigated trial. So the extension bulletin with this information can be found if you Google NDSU Variety Trials, and then you go and click on the dry bean results. And if you are on that site, you can then go to the trial results section, click over there, and you will get the variety trial booklet in PDF format. This will also be available at most of our extension centers, so you can obtain there a hard copy of this document. Another way to look at some variety trials is a tool that was developed about last year, and this can be found on vt.ag.ndsu.edu, and we will provide you with a resource list, including the links to those resources that I'm mentioning now, that will be available to you as we provide that email to you. So if we go to this particular tool and look at some of the dry bean information. So again, this is vt.ag.ndsu.edu, and then you click on the dry bean area for the crops. Then you can select any of the trials that you are interested that might be close to your home. In this particular tool, you also see that you can sort it by location, by an extension center, or also by the zip code. In this case, I highlight the dry bean in Langdon, and I go to the tool. And one of the things you can do in this tool is on the left-hand side, you can kind of show, highlight what information you're interested in. So I clicked the pounds per acre and the previous yield, and then you can select varieties. And in this case, I was looking at the black varieties, and then you see the 3 bars. The yellow bar is this year, and then the previous years are in the other colors. So you will be able to do an evaluation of yield, but also the days to maturity, and compare varieties if you wish to do so. So I'm now going to look a little bit at some data that was generated at Carrington, and this is found in the variety trial booklet. So this is the pinto information. So we find their maturity date, we find their direct harvest, protein, seed weight, and yield. So I'm going to look a little bit at the direct harvest number. So here is a table with 4 years. And when we say direct harvest, that is a relative score to estimate the percent of the beans that would be harvested successfully in a direct or a straight harvest. So it kind of is an indication of how nice that plant is standing up. and how easy it might be to harvest. So if you look at this table, you can first of all see that the numbers differ from year to year. That has to do with the product or how the plant has developed in that particular year. And if we then look at the average number, I want to point out a couple of things here, that there is definitely differences among the pinto, how the stature is, as well as the harvestability. And I marked here 2. Lariat would be 64%, whereas the other varieties might be high with 87% of the beans, if you just look at them, that will be harvestable. So this is an objective or a subjective score done by the agronomist to give an indication of harvestability. So now I'm going to go back to the same table, but I'm going to look a little bit at maturity. So you see the days to maturity in that column. And here's a picture of Andy Falcon and the Palomino, and you can see the Falcon is still green. So my question is, what is the relationship between the days of maturity and the yield? So here I have on the bottom the days to maturity to after planting and the yield. So you see there is in the irrigated trial a relationship that if the plants were a little bit longer in the field, they had a little bit more yield potential. So it is not only the days to maturity, but there's also really the genetic makeup of the plant that influences this. But typically when we can optimize the interception of sunlight, we would expect some more yield. If we are looking here at some of the results, we have, this is from 2022, 7 environments. This is all the data points in pounds per acre, but I'm interested in also showing the slow darkening. And now I'm looking at 32 environments, which is a lot more. And the numbers on top indicate the significant differences. And as Dr. Osorno already mentioned, Monterey is the one to beat for the pinto. Then if we just look at the blacks, you will see that with the black beans, this one is over the last 7 environments. You can see that Twilight and Black Tails and Eclipse all have an A, and the Zorro had a B, indicating that those 3 over those environments were similar. The last slide for this presentation will be looking at 19 site years, and you can see that there was no difference between Blacktails, Twilight, and Eclipse. So those are the black bean data. So in summary, it is important to obtain some good data on the varieties, select for harvestability, select for also disease tolerance. We're going to talk about that in detail in our disease section. And of course, look at multiple year data in order to make your selection for some of the varieties.